Hey everyone, and welcome to the fourth and final video for Chapter 18, where we'll finish discussing the Mongols. Now for this one, you look at the title of the slide, Eurasian Integration. Kind of a fancy way of saying that the Mongols, despite all of the destruction they caused and how violent they were responsible for a tremendous amount of interaction of people and cultural diffusion from Eastern Europe all the way to the Pacific. They encouraged travel and communication over long distances, and this in turn led to facilitation of a number of different things, such as trade. All right, you look at the Mongol Empire at its height, all the shaded area, and you look at the trade routes that either went directly through it or kind of circumvented it and so forth. But nomadic peoples, they relied on trade. They were dependent on trade because they were constantly moving around. And the Mongols were nomads at heart. Even after they settled down in Karakoram and, established the Ilkhanate, their tradition as a nomadic people, it had them, put a heavy emphasis on trade. And they ensured the safety of merchants. They made sure that merchants could travel around and do their business. It's very similar to the Pax Romana that we talked about during the time of the Roman peace. And this brought back the Silk Road. The Silk Road that had really kind of fallen apart after the collapse of the Han Dynasty and the Roman Empire. Now that starts to make a comeback during the Mongol era. Also diplomatic missions, the protection of travel benefited ambassadors. The different khanates maintained contact and they communicated with European and South Asian lands. So you constantly had government officials traveling all over the place. Missionaries, right? The Mongol tolerance of faith helped this. You had Buddhist missionaries that would travel all over the place, even Christian missionaries and so forth. They knew that they weren't going to be beheaded just for being a different faith. And you couldn't say that in other areas during the medieval era. Also, the use of conquered people, the resettlement of people. The Mongols made regular use of conquered people, with the possible exception, interestingly enough, of the Chinese, who they repressed. The conquered people with talent, they were brought to Karakoram to work as clerks, as soldiers, as scholars, as translators, as artisans. Kublai Khan had Persians, he had Arabs, he had Turks, he had even, Europeans, such as Marco Polo living there. He wanted to have a very eclectic cultural group around him. He didn't look at that as being a bad thing. And a lot of this had, it all came back to the facilitation of travel and communication through the Mongol area. You knew that it was safer to travel through Mongol territory, interestingly enough, than it was through many other parts of the world. However, the Mongol Empire was not going to last forever, and you saw certain areas fall into decline before the others. The Ilkhanate was one of the first ones. Economic decline, really kind of hurt it after a while, but also as the Mongols became kind of phased into the larger Persian culture, they started to lose their identity, and they also lacked strong leadership. In 1335, the Ilkhan died without any heir, and no one stepped up to take his place. And so it just ended really with just a whimper like that, very anticlimactic. The Yuan dynasty was a little more kind of defined in how it ended. There was economic decline, inflation due to the overuse of paper money, but a really catastrophic blow was with the outbreak of the bubonic plague. We think of the bubonic plague mostly with the Black Death in Europe, but it actually started in southern China. And unfortunately, the Mongol facilitation of trade and travel unwittingly led to the initial spread of the bubonic plague. It spread from merchants in China through Central Asia, and then once it made its way to the Middle East, merchants then carried it through the rest of Europe. We'll talk more about that in a later chapter. But this led to massive depopulation. Millions of people died, and also a decrease in trade. And then also you had the Chinese rebellion. The Chinese grew increasingly resentful of being treated as second-class citizens in their own land, and by 1340s, peasant rebellions had become very common. And then 1368, the Mongols were finally driven from China back there, and the Ming Dynasty kind of regained control of everything. Now, they weren't completely done, the Mongols. You did have some, here you go, see the Ming Dynasty and the Ming Great Wall. They would kind of fortify their northern borders in order to prevent them from coming back down. So 1368, that's the establishment of the Ming Dynasty. You did have some surviving Khanates. Despite the collapse of the two wealthiest ones, the Mongol control did not end in other areas. You see the Chagatai Khanate, the Central Asian one. Not sure what's going on with the pen there. No, we'll go all the way around. But this continued into the 18th century, and the Golden Horde dominated Russia until they were driven out by Russian princes in the 16th century. Many Mongols actually remained in the area. They settled down into this area, the Crimean Peninsula, and they would remain there up until the 20th century, until Stalin finally, drove them out with this Russification that he did when he became dictator. But yeah, the Golden Horde and the Chagatai Khanate, they kept on chugging along after the other two had collapsed. So, a couple of big themes about Mongol rule. One, this was a vast empire. As I said, the largest contiguous empire in the history of the world. They ended very long and established dynasties. We're talking about the Song dynasty in China. We're talking about the Abbasid dynasty in the Middle East. Also, this thing that sometimes you'll see textbook refer to as the Pax Mongolica. Now, that's a Latin term, so obviously the Mongols would not have used that term themselves, but they kind of copied the same idea from the Pax Romana, in that within the empire, it was a time of relative stability. Once you submitted to Mongol rule, and as long as you paid them on time, they were not overly bearing, kind of destructive overlords. They also helped facilitate trade, the kind of travel over large areas, but they were conquerors, not really effective rulers. They were not administrators. They failed to establish any Mongol bureaucracy or administrations. It's one of the reasons why when we talk about the Mongols, it's all about conquest. We don't talk about a golden age of Mongol rule where they made innovations in government or science or math or anything like that. And it's one of the reasons why in some areas their rule did not last all that particularly long. Right? But they had a huge, huge impact on world history throughout Europe, Asia, the Middle East, South Asia, Far East, and so forth. So that's, it's important not to understate that in terms of the whole, impact in world history. All right, so that wraps things up for the Mongols and Chapter 18.